Before we get into the installation, let me just hit a little bit on ceiling fan repair work too. Normally the only things that are going to go wrong with a ceiling fan technically would be some of the switching. Either a light switch or the fan switch. And what I have always liked to do is give away one little secret that they don't tell you about anywhere, and I'll do that with the fan switch. These switches come with wires when they're in the fan, okay? But as you can see, they don't come with wires on a repair switch. The ceiling fan wires that you have in your ceiling fan have hard ends. They're tinned. Okay, they may be stranded wire, but they're tinned. So when people cut them off, they cut off that tin end. Now you're left with stranded wire that you can't put back into this switch. All right. So there's two ways to go about that. Number one, with a paper clip, you can insert it into the hole and pull that wire out with the tin end. All right. Or if that doesn't work, just crush this switch with the pliers and take the wires out, and you'll save the tin ends. Before you do that, though, these switches have codes on them: L, 1, 2, and 3. L for the hot line, and then 1, 2, and 3 for the speeds. Mark those colors down with the numbers, because when you put them in, they have to correspond on the new switch. The light switch is strictly comes with wires. Okay, so you don't have to worry about it. You just wire it to the old wires. There's just two wires to worry about on a light switch usually. And that's all we have for ceiling repair for now, ceiling fan repair. Now, let's get into the new installation. First off, you're going to take your old fixture down, if there's a fixture there. When you take the wiring off, mark which is hot and which is neutral. Otherwise, you're going to have to resort to testing to figure out which is the hot wire, which is the switch wire, and which is the neutral wire. Everybody should have some sort of tester anyway if you're going to be working with electric. So we've marked that, test and mark the wiring. If you can, turn off the power. Makes sense. All right. If you have to install new wiring, we can get into that a little later in this class. There are basically two different types of ceiling fans. Number one, a downrod fan. Comes with a downrod, and that can vary in length. If you need a longer rod, you can buy longer rods. Sometimes if you don't want the rod, the canopy, in a lot of cases, can be bolted right to the motor, and that alleviates the rod. The other type is what's known as a ceiling hugger. All right, it's a much bigger base, but it fits up closer to the ceiling. So if you need that headroom for whatever reason, usually go with a ceiling hugger fan. If you have a cathedral ceiling, you'll usually be going with a downrod fan with longer rods. So those are your basic two types of fans that get installed. Different sizes for different size rooms. You'll go from about a 30-inch, very small fan for maybe a child's bedroom. Normal bedroom might take a 42-inch fan. If you have a big bedroom or whatever, you're stepping up, or living room, dining room, you're stepping up to a 52-inch fan. There are bigger fans than that. I've seen some 60-inch. I've seen some 72-inch for, very big rooms. And there are some made by a company, believe it or not, it's called the Big Ass Fan Company. And that's the name of their company, by the way, that they do work for NASA and whatnot. And I've seen some with 36 feet in diameter in aircraft hangars and things like that. But they make beautiful fans. If you're interested, look them up on the web. It's a fun story. Anyway, let's get back. If you're dealing with old if you're dealing with old boxes and old wiring, primarily what you'll end up with is a shallow ceiling pan box, okay, in old buildings. You won't find that in newer buildings from the 50s on, but before that you'll probably have old cloth wiring in very shallow boxes. If it's old cloth wiring, a lot of times those boxes will not have the screw ears in them. Okay, so how do you mount a light fixture or whatever onto a box without screw ears or a ceiling fan? Normally, I don't recommend the fixture bars because they're pretty weak and they're designed for ceiling fixtures and not ceiling fans. So how do we go about putting in a ceiling fan? If there is a center gas pipe, and normally that center gas pipe in the old ceiling boxes would be 3/8 inch pipe. It's about 95% of all of it. The next size up would be 1/2 inch. Normally your brackets that come with a ceiling fan, there are three different types actually. For a hugger, you usually have a long flat plate of some sort with a hole in the center. For the down rod, there's two different types. There's a type that is a round pan with extensions on it to hold the ball of the down rod, or then you have a top hat, which only is like a bent bracket. How do we get those into an old box without any screw ears? If they have a center pipe for the pans, and for the hugger type, they usually come with a round hole right in the center, okay? That round hole is usually a lot bigger than the 3/8 inch pipe, so you need a washer in order to hold that bracket up to the ceiling. If you have a top hat type that doesn't have a center hole, it's just empty in the center, you have two different choices. You can either drill and tap this box, cut threads into it, okay, like this. The taps come with a drill bit that is numbered, okay. This tap, the 1024 tap, just says right on the package that it takes a number 25 machinist bit, okay. This is not something you're going to find in most small hardware stores. Most hardware stores will not carry machinist bits. So if in fact you are going to drill and tap, you have to look for those kind of bits. The next is what is known as a jack nut. It's basically a nut that installs almost like a rivet, all right? What I would do is drill this box normally where you would see, near the edge where you'd see the normal screws. This nut actually takes a 3/8 inch bit, all right? Drill 2 holes for that. And then this pushes in to that hole. There's a little wrench that holds it with these dimples on it. And as you tighten the screw, all right, the wrench is holding this from turning, and this, again, shrinks down and flares out, so it would actually flare on the back side of this box and hold solid. And it's almost like a threaded rivet, okay? And that gives you your screw threads, either way, drilling and tapping, or drilling and installing one of the jack nuts into the box. It's a preferred method. A lot of times, and the reason I say these are the preferred methods is because there are some fixture brackets that are wide, but in a lot of cases, these old boxes have masses of cloth wiring in them. And what you don't want to do is disturb that old cloth wiring because it's a mess then. Then you have to pull new wires if you destroy that old cloth wiring. If in fact you do have an old box like that, I would recommend, instead of the hugger type, always go with a down rod type, because if you need more room for your wiring, okay, without disturbing it, you can always add an extension collar like that to go along with the canopy. And those extension collars only work with the down rod type. You can't get an extension collar this big for a hugger fan. So if in fact you're dealing with old wiring, I would always recommend going with a down rod fan as opposed to a hugger fan. Because the hugger fan comes with a flat bracket that you have to mash up to the ceiling to get it tight. All brackets have to be tight, but at least with this type you can get an extension ring if you need it, okay? The tools necessary for the installation, nothing more than your standard electric tools. You'll probably need a wire strip or a screwdriver. This actually took the place of this tap. They're commonly known as triple taps, or in this case there's 6 different taps on here for different size screws. Normally with a ceiling fan you'll be dealing with either a 1022 thread or a 1024 thread like this that come with most ceiling fans. They're slightly heavier than the standard box. Standard ceiling box takes an 832. There's nothing wrong with putting a ceiling fan on an older box. The reason most places will sell ceiling fan boxes now are the fact that it started in California to be earthquake proof. They're using heavier screws just so nothing will break loose. You know, they weigh a little bit more than your standard light fixture. But we've been installing fans with 832 screws on old ceiling boxes for 50, 60 years, so don't be afraid to do it. It works just fine. If in fact you are installing a new ceiling fan in a place where there is no electric, you have 1 or 2 choices. You can cut the ceiling apart to get in a big bracket and mount a standard ceiling fan box. Most ceiling fan boxes actually now come with 2 sets of screws, one for a standard light fixture and one heavier set, usually 1024 or 1032 for the ceiling fans. So it can go with both. If in fact you're doing a remodeling where you're just going to cut a hole in the ceiling and you want to get a box in there, that's why they make these what are known as screw brackets. You can see the bracket has a big screw on it, all right, it's part of the bracketry. And what you're doing, in fact, is strictly cutting a small hole in the ceiling. This bracket gets inserted up into that hole, and then between the joists and the ceiling, this thing starts screwing apart, and these sharp points dig into the 2 joists. And you've got a very solid, heavy bracket then to hold your ceiling fan. And then the ceiling fan is then mounted, or the box is mounted to that bracket. In the meantime, you're running your wire and everything where you have to run it, okay, down to a wall switch if in fact that is your case. If there is no wall switch on an older installation or even a new installation, then you're strictly dealing, you know, with the pull chain switches on the fan itself. If in fact you are going to put a wall switch in, you have numerous different types. Strictly speaking, you can, since the fan is controlled by the switches on the fan itself, all you may want on the wall is just a standard on-off switch, but you can get much fancier after that. Most ceiling fans do come with lights. That's why I only have the double controllers here. These type of switches, and you'll notice in your drawing, will control both the lights and the fan with one of their controls. And they have to have two switch wires, one for the fan and one for the light. So you have to be aware of what you need to pull in new wiring if in fact you're doing that kind of installation. This type with the remotes, and there are remotes also that work on the wall switches, usually come with a module that has to be installed up in the ceiling fan that is controlled by the remote, whether it's a wall remote or a handheld remote like this. All right, it simplifies the wiring because the wire acts as a signal, okay? This thing has an antenna on it, and all the wiring from this module to the fan is in the fan itself. It's not going from the fan down the wall to the other controllers. So it makes it a little easier in terms of wiring, especially in an older installation where you may only have one switch wire that was used for a light fixture. So again, you can use that type of controller, but you have to be aware that the modules go in the fan and they're coded to work with the sending unit. You can't take a module from one company and a sending unit from another company because they won't work. It has to be the same company. All right, when we get the ceiling fan, first operation is take it out of the box and count the parts. And I laugh at that, but you'd be surprised at how many times something will be missing. Your only course there is to take that ceiling fan back. All right, now that you've got all the parts, put the ceiling fan together to make sure everything fits. All right. You don't want to get half the ceiling fan up on the ceiling and then start putting the blades on later, and all of a sudden you realize that something's wrong with the screws that are holding the blades. It happens. So you want to put this thing together as much as possible on the floor to make sure you have all the parts and all the parts fit properly. Right? The same thing, it can actually be tested on the floor. I don't really recommend it, simply because somebody has to be holding it and these fan blades are wide. But you can literally, before you put the fan blades on, you can test the motor to make sure it works and there's nothing wrong with it. Just by hooking up the wires and plugging it in and turning the fan on, the motor will spin. If there's no blades on the fan, you probably cannot discern the different speeds other than low and high. Medium probably, because there's no load on the motor at that point, so your speeds, it's kind of hard to discern. You're just looking to see, make sure it turns, make sure the bearings aren't making any noise at that point. How do you get a fully assembled fan up on the ceiling and wired at the same time? Most of your brackets on all of these have a hook in them, okay? And it's designed usually to hook into one of the hooks of the bracketry, okay? You can see on this type of thing, there's holes in the canopy that can just hook onto that hook while you're doing your wiring. All right, make sure all your wiring is clean before you put the canopy up, because you don't want to catch any of the wiring between the ball and the bracket and the canopy. Otherwise, just the swinging itself of the fan is going to chew through that wiring and cause a short. So you have to make sure all your wiring is clean before you button the canopy up. As you're putting the fan up, okay, the bracket itself, the ceiling bracket, is the number one stabilizing point. That ceiling bracket has to be tight to the ceiling. That's the first thing you want to check if your fan is wobbling. Take the canopy down and make sure that that bracket that holds the ceiling fan itself is tight up to the ceiling. If that's moving, the fan's going to wobble and there's nothing you can do at that point. All right, so as you put that bracket up to the box itself, okay, you want to make sure that that bracket is tight to the ceiling. They usually come with rubber mounts also, so it can't turn when somebody turns the ceiling fan on. There's a little torque usually. All right, those rubber brackets, those rubber pads, prevent that. But in order to prevent that, it has to be tight. All right. Number one rule for a fan that is moving: make sure that that ceiling fan bracket is tight to the ceiling. Number two, make sure that all the blades are tight, and especially with a down rod fan now, one of the things that you can check is the blade height, or the drop from the ceiling to the tip of the blade. And the way to check that is you just take a tape measure with the fan off, put that tape measure up to the ceiling, and slowly rotate the fan blades to make sure they hit the same place on that tape, or if you have a yardstick or whatever, okay. You don't want more than a 1/4 inch variance. All right, if you have more than that, more than likely one of these brackets is bent. All right. You can gently adjust that. Some of these brackets, you know, can have a little bend in them, that just by taking that blade and moving it up or down a little bit will straighten that out. Or there's ways to actually add, because most of these blades are mounted with 3 screws, there's ways to tilt that blade on the bracket just by using washers either on the front 2 screws or the back, to either raise or lower it a little bit on the bracket itself. A lot of cases that's not recommended. It's better to try and bend the bracket first. But when I say gently, I mean gently, because a little too much pressure and these things will snap. And you don't want that, because now your fan is dead. If in fact you need new blades and or a bracket for a fan, you have to go back to the same company. All right. Westinghouse is not going to make a bracket for Home Impressions or any of the others. You need to keep the same brand, and more than likely even the same model number, because all these blades have different screw patterns, and all the brackets have different screw patterns that hold it to the motor, and different screws. I've seen at least a dozen different types of different screws, and that's not even including the threading, but I mean different styles of screws that hold that bracket to the motors. So that's why when you take this thing apart, you want to make sure that you have all the parts, because some of these screws are designed for the fan itself, and you won't find them in a hardware store, even this one, because they're special screws, and usually special colors to go with the bracketry and the fan itself. If you have to pull new wiring, or you're installing new wiring, obviously you're going to want to make sure that you have the correct amount of wires based upon the switching you're installing, whether it's a hot wire, 2 switch wires, light and fan, and the neutral. Most installations now, especially with some of the smart switching, these switches require a neutral in that box, which is not true of a lot of older switching that just required the hot and the switch wires. A lot of the smart switch stuff now, you have to be careful, because they're intelligent switches and they have to be on all the time. They require a neutral in them. So, in fact, the National Electric Code now says that all switching where you're running new wiring, those switch boxes will have a neutral wire pulled into them. Whether they're used or not is another story. But it's a change because of all this new smart switching going on. If you have old wiring and you wanted to replace it with new wiring, the best way to do it is take one of the old wires, hook your new wires to it, and pull with the old wire, all right? Especially if you're dealing with old cloth wiring. If you're dealing with old cloth wiring and you have to actually pull a new wire into that, that would be the only way I would recommend doing it. Simply because if you put a fish tape into the pipe with old cloth wire, you'll probably eat through the cloth itself and cause a short. And if that wiring's hot and you arc into the conduit, you've just lost the conduit, your fish tape, and the wiring. Because once that's welded together, nothing's going to work anymore. So be very careful with, having the power off if you're especially trying to pull new wire through an existing pipe with existing wire. Make sure those circuits that are in that pipe are off in case anything happens. Whether it's new insulation or old, doesn't matter. I would recommend that every circuit in that pipe, make sure it's off. All right? And you can test that with some of the non-contact testers that you might have multiple wires going through that box and going to other rooms. So you have to make sure that all the circuitry is off. Normally with a non-contact tester you can test that to make sure that all that wiring has been turned off at the fuse or circuit breaker box. Most modern fans today have one of two bases. The newer fans will either have your lighting will have either the candelabra base, the small base that's normally used in chandeliers, or it'll have the intermediate base that is normally used for appliances like refrigerators and microwaves and things like that. But that's due to our governmental regulations. Probably about 95% of the old fans just have the standard base. You will not find the standard base on most of your newer fans. Now, one of the things I have found is that some of the newer light kits, they say are LED. Believe it or not, some of the manufacturers are providing a standard LED bulb. It's not really an LED fixture. They actually put LED bulbs into the light kits, and they went back to the standard base. So make sure you know what base, bulb your fan takes for your lights. So there's now 3 possibilities, plus the LED bulbs too, which some of just went right back to a standard base. Make sure everything's tight. The bracket is tight to begin with. Make sure that the ball that goes into that ceiling bracket, there's a notch that it'll click into so it can't turn when the fan is going, all right? Make sure that that ball and the bracket that holds it, that notch is aligned so that ball can't turn. And then when the canopy's up, make sure that the canopy is tight to the bracket. That also limits the ball moving. Some fans actually come with a separate plate outside of the canopy that'll actually lock the ball to the bracket before the canopy goes on. So some do have that feature. Other fans, instead of a notch on the ball, will have like a tri-lobe. The Hunter fans do that. They don't have a notched ball. They have a tri-lobe ball that actually fits into a triangular opening in the bracket itself, and so that can't turn either.